Amanda Dawn Christie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
This, of course, is something, a project that is near and dear to our hearts here at Radio Canada International. But for you, it started out as, well, what did it start out as? It was an art project, and what inspired you?
Well, it started, I had done a radio building workshop when I was living in Sackville, New Brunswick, and I built this little toilet paper tube radio, and I picked up Italian radio, and I thought, oh, I did a good job. Turns out I didn't. I was just really close to these big international towers, and some people heard the radio in their sink. I was jealous because I didn't hear the radio in my sink, so I started trying to build a radio receiver out of plumbing and a sink, and through that, I wound up meeting various people in Sackville who shared stories of hearing, this would be more back in the 50s and 60s, hearing the radio in their fridge, their toaster, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. And so then that project had other elements, and then I decided I thought I would film the radio towers because it's so iconic on the landscape. You have this flat marshland landscape and these 13 very tall towers with the red lights at night. So I was going to just I'm an experimental filmmaker, so it was going to be a landscape film with footage of the towers over an entire year, 4 seasons, different weather conditions, and I would do a soundscape with all these different stories. But then after I started filming, they announced the site was being decommissioned, and so then that changed the project entirely, and I decided to make sure to wait for the demolition and to document that as well as a final chapter. I mean, I was hoping it wouldn't actually happen, but I made sure that I was available in case it did. And then because of that, I made sure to honor the stories as well. My initial plan had been to, really do something abstract with my sound recordings. But then when I found out the site was being decommissioned, I felt it was important to create a historical document that would honor the stories and go beyond just the radio and the sinks in the fridge and talk to technicians who had worked there and listeners who had listened overseas and to really get a much broader picture of the relationship with that site.
Now, we should clarify something. When people are getting it on their toasters and lamps and refrigerators and so on, it's because the sound signals were so powerful from the transmitters that anything sort of in the neighborhood might potentially pick up the voice of Canada, as it were.
Yes, exactly. I did some, when I was trying to make my radio sync work, I found it was a phenomenon called external rectification, or the rusty bolt effect. So if you had just the right amount of conductive, like pipe or something with a badly soldered joint somewhere, it would basically create a diode, like a foxhole radio that was used in World War I. And so and it depended when they were broadcasting. So there was one woman who, her house was in the Africa beam. So whenever they broadcast to Africa, sound would come out of her sink. So it was kind of, you had to be in the right place at the right time with the right amount of pipes. But a lot of it had to do with being so close to such a high power station.
Now, again, your original soundscape, that was to, I believe, if I remember correctly, it was to catch the sound of the guy wires and so on vibrating with the wind and so on, which, because they were all under slightly different tensions and so on. Well, you can explain it, yeah.
Yeah, well, and that was not necessarily the original one. That actually happened while I was waiting for the demolition of the site. I'd done my filming and I wasn't sure if it was going to come down or not. And the site was inactive. So for a period of 2 years, I thought, what will I do? And so then I decided to put contact microphones on the actual towers. So because they weren't transmitting, it was safe. So I would go out there and contact microphones. They turn vibration into sound. It's the same principle as a pickup on a guitar. If you play an acoustic guitar, you put a pickup on it, it amplifies the resonance. So these contact microphones were basically treating the towers themselves and the guy wires and the halyards like giant piano strings, essentially, like Aeolian harps. They're 400 feet. I mean, that's like a 40-story building. Standing in the high marsh winds, and they have these vibrations that you can't hear with the human ear, but when you put that microphone on, it was kind of like, they're really beautiful drones, and it's kind of, it felt to me like I was hearing the heartbeat. It was like a doctor putting a stethoscope on someone and hearing their heartbeat. I felt like I was hearing their heartbeat, but it was droney, and each one had its own different type of sound.
What was it like for the people in the area? Because, again, you spoke to some of the people, the technicians and the people. when they found out that after so many decades, this iconic symbol of Canada was to be no more?
It was heartbreaking. Really, it was for people in the area. I mean, some people knew what the site was for, some didn't. It was just like an iconic landmark that when you're driving, you know you're almost home when you see it. I know when I was a kid, I just assumed every town had one of these. You're like, oh, it's just like this piece of industrial infrastructure that you take for granted when you live there. And then, of course, you know, there's the people who knew what it was, who were concerned. And then in terms of the technicians, people were losing jobs. And then there's the social and political aspect, the importance of shortwave radio, too, the people who were aware of what this site did. I think there was an awareness that this was an immense loss because, you know, authoritarian, like you said yourself, authoritarian regimes censor the internet, and shortwave is very accessible. So I think within the town of Sackville, both residents who lived there, whether they listened to radio, that radio or not, as well as technicians, there was an immense sense of loss. It was very heartbreaking. And there was a sense of hope that there's a feeling like this can't be happening. It's going to be saved. Like there was the RCI Action Committee, there were petitions. And so I think there was a certain element of disbelief as well. So there was heartbreaking, there was hope, there was disbelief. And the moment it started becoming real was when the lights started burning out, like red lights were going out. And when you live there, those red lights at night were, I mean, it was the only thing you could see. And gradually there were less and less. And I know when I was doing the film, I did some night time lapses, and I saw them as tests because not all the lights were on. And I thought, okay, well, I'll redo these when they replace the lights. And I remember talking with the head of transmission in Halifax and said, so when are you going to replace the bulbs? And he said, oh, well, we're not. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, because we're tearing them down, and it's about, you know, it's very expensive, the riggers and everything. And that was when it really struck home. You're like, oh, as the lights go out, they're not getting replaced. And someone in the film, she commented, it was like watching someone die slowly. And I think listeners who listen to RCI wouldn't have had that experience because you either hear it, it's on the air, or it's not. But when you live there and it's a 2-year period and gradually another light goes out and then another, that was heartbreaking.
So this turned out to be a documentary, a full-length feature film kind of documentary in a way. Tell me about the title. I mean, Spectres of Shortwave. There's significance to that.
Yeah. And I mean, initially when I started, because it was before the site was going to be decommissioned, I was thinking more along, you know, theoretical lines like Derrida's book Spectres of Marx, and very kind of academic approach. But then when they announced the site coming down, it was like, oh, it took on this other side of you know, remnants of something that was there that is no more, the idea of ghosts. One of my friends at one point said, oh, you're interested in the paranormal and radio. And I was like, no, not at all. Why? And he mentioned, well, you know, in the early days when they discovered electromagnetism and radio in the 1890s, there were the spiritualists who were like physicists and scientists who believed radio would be the gateway to the spiritual realm and the paranormal. And that's why a lot of movies will have ghosts appearing on the AM bandwidth on TVs and radios. So this person thought my film was about that. And I was like, no, I'm not going there. But it's also kind of interesting, and these kind of parallels, whether you're looking at the idea of specters of Marx and the political side of things, or if you're looking at the paranormal spiritual side, or the fact that this was a site that is no more. It's a trace, it's a shadow. The French title Ombre des Ondes translates to shadows of shortwave. So specters and shadows, they're traces of something that was there that has dissipated, and it's kind of there in terms of memory, but the physical presence is no more. It's been transferred from, I guess, matter to energy.
Now, this film has been out for a while. What kind of reaction have you been getting from audiences? I expect a lot of them don't even know about it. The fact that RCI was there and is no more there.
Yeah, so it's actually been interesting, audience, because I would classify it as an experimental documentary. Like, so there's no talking heads, but you have the stories. I treat the soundtrack as more like a radio documentary that you listen to while you're watching landscape images. So you never see the people talking, and that's different from a lot of documentaries. So when I've shown it to audiences who didn't know about RCI, both Canadian and American audiences, I remember one screening in New York. I had some people in the audience cried at one point. I had someone yell at the screen at one point. I thought, wow, okay, if I can get people to laugh, cry, and yell at the screen during a film where you don't see any humans about radio towers, that's something. And audiences who know the site, there was a screening in Sackville, and there was one at the International Shortwave Convention in Pennsylvania of shortwave listeners. Both of those, there's definitely a point where there's a very emotional reaction from the audience. And for me, that's kind of interesting, because for me, it was very emotional. But I thought, well, I've been working on the project for 10 years. Of course, it's emotional to me. I was like, who's going to feel anything for this inanimate industrial infrastructure? They're inanimate objects, it's metal. But the emotional response to the film was very surprising. I was happily surprised. But it's very interesting that audiences who know the site and those who don't have emotional reactions to it.
Well, you touched on something that I find interesting, because as a filmmaker, you're involved in the project. You're there, and so perhaps not necessarily as emotionally involved because you're worried about the technique and what you're going to show and editing and so on and so forth. But now as it's finished and you step back, what are your emotions about the situation and what you've documented?
Yeah, it's interesting. Because during filming, I was able to kind of protect myself from my emotions by focusing on the technique. I definitely did that, for sure. I know that when I finished filming, there was a huge kind of emotional response and fatigue after it was all filmed. It was like, whoa, that really happened. It took me a year or two to finish it after I finished filming, also because I was working alone. So that, to process all the emotions and that. Now that it's finished and it's out, it's interesting. I worked on other projects related to the site as well, so it's always kind of present. But it feels so long ago. Which is kind of weird to say. And with a film, sometimes it can travel without me. It'll screen so like in Calgary, and I'm here in Montreal, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's happening now. So but it's something that's always very present, because a lot of my work is still about both the RCI site and radio waves and shortwave in general. So it feels like it's still relevant, but I still have that kind of the technical approach to the work, whether it's the execution of the work or distribution and figuring out how to get it out and where. I almost protect myself from my emotions by thinking of that stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I just wondering, I guess, would it be when the towers started coming down, was the shock of, that's it. It isn't coming back.
Yeah. When the first tower fell, I didn't have much notice. That shot, I missed the first tower actually by 15 minutes. The second tower, I didn't even have a tripod. My equipment, I didn't have time to get to Halifax. Someone was driving up with it. The second tower falling, my camera was actually balanced on the bumper of my van. So in the footage, you actually see it's in the parking lot of the facility, and you see the shockwave hit the camera because it wasn't on a tripod. And that one, when that tower fell, I felt it in my chest, and there was, my eyes got wet, and I was like, whoa, this is real. For the rest of the demolition, which is spread over a few months, I didn't have much of an emotional reaction. I was just filming. And then after the last tower fell, the demolition crew left. I was alone on the site, and I'd gone up on the roof, and I filmed this kind of panning of the site at sunset, where everything was like laying in the field, they were almost like dead bodies. It was like a war field. And so I panned, and then I come down, load the van, and I was about to leave because I was done. And then it dawned on me, I was like, oh wait, I'm done. I'm never coming back. And it was that moment It was the ground was covered in snow. The moon was out, the stars were out. So it was one of those bright winter nights where the moon's reflecting off the snow, and I realized there's no more red lights, and it was weird to be there with no red lights, and I felt this isn't in the film. This was just when you ask about the emotions of it, I felt compelled for some reason. I didn't feel ready to leave, and I walked up to I was by myself. It was quite late at this point by the time I packed my gear, and I walked out to the last tower that had fallen, and I just felt kind of, for some reason, compelled to touch it, almost like a last rites or a laying of hands or something. And at the moment I touched it, I just wept. And it was very bizarre because this is an inanimate object. It's a piece of metal. It's not like a person dying, but I don't know if it was, the fatigue from the end of a long project, or just all of a sudden it realized the immensity of what just happened and what I witnessed. And I remember standing there for a little while, and then eventually it was like something dissipated, and there's a feeling like it's over. And that experience really stuck with me. So when I was editing the film and making future projects, I was continually asking myself, how can I be true to that feeling of bearing witness to something? This feeling of my role wasn't to teach people or to educate them, but to try to create an experience where they could bear witness in a similar way that I did. And I guess that's the emotional connection to me, was that feeling of having been present at that moment and witnessing, I guess. Yeah.
I can detect a bit of emotion in your voice.
Yeah.
Well, Amanda Dawn Christie, where can people see this? I mean, they're listening to us on the internet, and of course, that goes around the world. Where can people actually get a hold of this film or see? I know on Vimeo there are parts of it.
Yeah, so I'm still kind of struggling with that part. So the first 2 years of a film's life, it does the festival circuit, and if it's released publicly, they won't take it. I did struggle a bit with festivals because mainstream ones felt it was too experimental because there's no talking heads. Experimental ones felt it was too narrative because the documentary aspect. So it fell through the cracks. It's now starting to show a bit more in some micro cinemas. It's currently at Daisy Bao Gallery in Montreal until the 26th, where it's playing on a loop daily, noon and 2 p.m. from Tuesdays to Saturdays in a nice theater with 5.1 sound. It'll be in Toronto in April at vertical screenings at the Art Gallery of Ontario. I've just made some DVDs and Blu-rays for people who were in the film and who contributed so they can finally have their own copy. And I'm going to try to work with a distributor to find some way to do hopefully maybe on-demand viewing or something, but it hasn't been. I'm just at the beginning stages now of hopefully getting that sorted out by this summer or fall. So right now it's still doing the galleries and screening rooms, and I'm making copies for people who are in it. And then the next step will be figuring out how to make it more widely accessible.
Well, Amanda Dawn Christie, thank you so much for this, and congratulations on the film.
Thank you.